Individuals with genetic diseases and/or disabilities are often perceived as having a depreciated quality of life simply for having their respective conditions. Critical decisions are then made based on preconceptions and assumptions about the quality of life of these individuals. These decisions could be in the social context, such as political rights or discrimination, or in the medical context, based on genetic information for medical procedures like PGD or CRISPR technologies. These assumptions are often made by people who don't have experience living with or even knowing someone who lives with a given type of medical circumstance. As somebody who was born with a genetic disease, in my case, Fanconi anemia, I can attest to the quality of life considerations in both social and medical contexts of individuals with genetic diseases, with or without a disability. Now, one common misconception is that social discrimination actually depreciates the quality of life of individuals like myself. However, that's not necessarily the case, and it depends on our individual interpretations or our personalities. For example, when I was 16, I went to the post office to mail something for a business of mine, and when I went to use my newly acquired debit card legally with my name on it, I was refused service because the staff just couldn't even conceive of the fact that an individual of my size at my age could actually hold a debit card. I went back to that same post office about a week later to prove my identity and to argue with the staff and the supervisors until they finally allowed me to use it. I took that situation and turned it into an opportunity. And that was my choice. So the social discrimination didn't necessarily depreciate my quality of life because I chose to turn it into an opportunity that could benefit both myself in advocacy and it could benefit the staff for learning about someone who doesn't fit the standard social categories. It wasn't necessarily my choice or my preference to have to deal with that situation, but nonetheless, I persisted. We all have preferences in this life, right? Some of you might prefer not to have to drive to work or to take a job that you don't want. Maybe you prefer to have $1 million. But you know what? It's not necessarily going to happen. And it doesn't mean that our lives are any less valuable because we don't have those preferences met. I have preferences too. I would prefer to be taken seriously at the post office. I'd prefer to have more energy to take advantage of more life experiences. I'd prefer to not have to explain my situation to people simply because they see that I'm of a different physical appearance than the average. But again, that doesn't necessarily make our lives any less valuable because our preferences weren't met. And speaking of unfortunate situations, another common misconception regarding genetics is that genetic mutations alone automatically impact the individual later in life by causing the disease. However, this isn't necessarily the case because genetic mutations can affect an individual to varying degrees, or they could have different symptoms than other people with the same condition might have, or the disease could onset at any given point in time in an individual's life, or could not have an impact on the individual's life at all, and therefore not affect quality of life at all. For example, I possess the genetic mutation of a rare form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. However, it's not enough to make a diagnosis officially because I don't have any of the symptoms. Therefore, the mutation certainly alone does not cause any depreciated quality of life. Whereas with my Fanconi anemia genetic mutation, it does affect me. It does affect my body. It did onset at an early time of my life. However, that still does not necessarily depreciate my quality of life because it goes back to preferences and what you're willing to appreciate versus what you don't have. For example, you might prefer to not have to pay for medical insurance, or you might prefer not to be suddenly hospitalized, or you might prefer not to have that surgery. I have preferences too. I would prefer not to have to see 10 specialty doctors in a year. I might prefer to speak louder, or to walk straighter, or to see better. But those still doesn't necessarily mean that life is any less worth living if we don't have those preferences met. For nobody should be dictating whose lives are more valuable than others. No matter who you are or what your life circumstance is, your life is just as important as others. For life is worth living for its own sake. So never assume that you know what others' lives are like, for they may be better than you'd expect. And never take this life for granted. Cherish it. Notice and appreciate what you have, not what you don't have. For our quality of life is really what we make of it.